The diner's neon sign flickered like a dying heartbeat, casting a sickly pink glow over the cracked pavement of Highway 17. It was 2 a.m., and the world outside Nancy's diner was a void of silence, save for the occasional rumble of a truck slicing through the night. Inside, Nancy Miller, a 32-year-old waitress with tired eyes and a smile that hid 1,000 wounds, wiped down the counter for the third time that hour. Her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of a life that felt like it was unraveling thread by thread. The bell above the door hadn't chimed in hours, but tonight, something darker than the emptiness outside was coming for her, a shadow that would push her to the edge and force her to confront the ghost she'd spent years running from. This wasn't just another shift. This was the night that would break her, or make her. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of a single moment to change everything, please hit that like button, drop a comment, share this story, and subscribe to Gentle Hearts. Your support keeps these stories alive. Nancy's life hadn't always been confined to the greasy linoleum floors of the diner. Once, she dreamed of being a painter, her canvases bursting with colors that spoke of hope and freedom. She'd grown up in a small town not far from this very highway, raised by a mother who chain-smoked and a father who left when she was 6. Art was her escape, her way of making sense of a world that seemed determined to crush her. But dreams don't pay bills, and by 19, Nancy was pregnant, alone, and working double shifts at a gas station to keep a roof over her head. Her daughter, Lily, now 13, was the only light in her life, but even that light flickered under the strain of poverty, exhaustion, and a past that refused to stay buried. Nancy's ex, Tommy, had been a charmer with a cruel streak, his fists as quick as his apologies. She'd left him 5 years ago, but the scars, both the ones on her skin and the ones etched into her soul, still ached. The diner was her refuge, a place where she could lose herself in the rhythm of pouring coffee and scrubbing plates, but it was also a cage, chaining her to a life of survival rather than living. The night of the last straw began like any other. Nancy moved through her routine with mechanical precision, her auburn hair pulled into a messy bun, her apron stained with ketchup and coffee. The diner was empty except for Old Man Jenkins, a regular who nursed his black coffee and muttered about the weather. Nancy liked Jenkins, he was kind, even if his stories rambled. But tonight, his presence felt like a thin shield against the unease creeping up her spine. The air felt heavy, like the calm before a storm, and every creak of the building made her flinch. She chalked it up to exhaustion. She hadn't slept properly in weeks, not since the letters started arriving. Anonymous, typed notes slipped under her apartment door, each one more unsettling than the last. "I see you, Nancy," one read. "You can't run forever," said another. She hadn't told anyone, not even Lily, who was staying with a friend tonight. Nancy didn't want to scare her daughter, but the fear was eating her alive, gnawing at the edges of her courage. As the clock ticked past 2:30, the bell above the door jingled, and Nancy's heart lurched. A man stepped inside, his boots heavy on the floor, his face shadowed by a baseball cap pulled low. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a leather jacket that smelled faintly of cigarettes and motor oil. He slid into a booth without a word, his movements deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. Nancy's instinct screamed at her to run, but she forced a smile and approached with her notepad. The man ordered a coffee, his voice low and gravelly, but his eyes never met hers. Instead, they darted around the diner, lingering on the exits, the windows, the empty corners. Nancy's hands shook as she poured his coffee, spilling a few drops on the table. He didn't react, but the air between them crackled with unspoken tension. She retreated to the counter, her pulse racing, and glanced at Jenkins, who was oblivious, lost in his coffee and his thoughts. The man in the booth wasn't just a customer. He was a warning. The night spiraled from there. Another customer arrived, a wiry man with a nervous twitch and a backpack slung over one shoulder. He sat at the counter, too close to Nancy for comfort, and ordered a burger, but his eyes kept flicking to the man in the booth. Nancy's gut churned. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The letters, the late-night calls with no one on the other end, the feeling of being watched, it all converged in this moment, in this diner, with these strangers. She thought of Lily, her bright, curious daughter who deserved so much more than a mother who was always one step from breaking. Nancy wanted to be strong for her, to be the hero Lily saw in her, but fear was a heavy chain, and it was dragging her down. She busied herself with cleaning, trying to focus on the familiar tasks, but her hands betrayed her, dropping a glass that shattered across the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet diner, and both men turned to look at her, their gazes sharp and unreadable. The tension built like a storm gathering strength. The man in the booth stood, his coffee untouched, and walked to the jukebox in the corner. He punched in a song, some old country tune that felt out of place in the sterile glow of the diner, and the music filled the space, slow and mournful. Nancy's skin prickled. She didn't know why, but the song felt like a signal, a countdown to something inevitable. The wiry man at the counter started tapping his fingers, a nervous rhythm that matched the pounding of her heart. Jenkins, sensing the shift in the air, finally looked up, his roomy eyes narrowing. "You okay, Nancy?" he asked, his voice a lifeline in the growing darkness. She nodded, but the light tasted bitter. She wasn't okay. She hadn't been okay for a long time. Then it happened. The man in the booth pulled a knife from his jacket, the blade catching the light as he moved toward the counter. The wiry man reacted instantly, reaching into his backpack and pulling out a gun. Nancy froze, her breath caught in her throat, as the diner transformed into a battlefield. Jenkins shouted, scrambling to his feet, but he was too slow, too old. The man with the knife lunged at the wiry man, and the gun went off, the sound deafening. Nancy dropped to the floor behind the counter, her hands over her ears, her mind screaming for Lily, for safety, for a way out. The bullet missed its mark, shattering the jukebox instead, and the music cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of chaos. The two men grappled, their struggle a blur of violence, and Nancy realized with sickening clarity that this wasn't random. They were here for her. She crawled toward the kitchen, her knees scraping against the broken glass on the floor. Her mind raced, piecing together the fragments of her past. Tommy. It had to be Tommy. The letters, the threats, the way these men seemed to know her without saying a word, it all pointed to him. He'd found her, just as he'd promised the night she'd left him, when he'd sworn she'd never be free. But why now? Why after all these years? Nancy's fear gave way to a flicker of anger, a spark of defiance. She wasn't the same broken woman who'd fled with nothing but a duffel bag and a baby. She'd built a life, however fragile, and she wasn't going to let him, or anyone, take it from her. In the kitchen, Nancy grabbed a butcher knife from the counter, her hands steadying as resolve replaced panic. She wasn't a fighter, but she was a mother, and that was enough. She crept back to the dining area, where the men were still locked in their struggle, blood now staining the floor. Jenkins was slumped against the wall, clutching his chest, his face pale. Nancy's heart twisted, but she couldn't help him yet. She had to end this. The man with the gun had gained the upper hand, pinning the other to the ground, but he hadn't seen her. Nancy moved silently, her breath shallow, and when the man raised his gun to deliver a final blow, she acted. She drove the knife into his shoulder, not deep enough to kill, but enough to make him scream and drop the weapon. The man with the knife seized the moment, scrambling to his feet, but instead of attacking her, he ran, disappearing into the night. The diner fell silent, save for the wiry man's groans and Jenkins' labored breathing. Nancy dropped the knife, her body shaking as the adrenaline drained away. She rushed to Jenkins, helping him sit up, her hands gentle despite the chaos. He was alive, but he needed a doctor. She called 911, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. As she waited for the ambulance, she pieced together the truth. The wiry man wasn't working for Tommy, he was Tommy's brother, sent to scare her, to remind her of the control Tommy still thought he had. The man with the knife was a drifter, hired muscle who'd gotten in over his head. The police arrived, and the truth unraveled further. Tommy was in jail, arrested weeks ago for another crime, but his obsession with Nancy hadn't died. The letters, the men, the terror, it was all his final attempt to break her from behind bars. Nancy sat in the diner long after the police left, Jenkins safely in an ambulance, the wiry man in custody. The neon sign still flickered, but the darkness outside didn't feel so heavy anymore. She'd faced her worst fear and survived. More than that, she'd fought. For herself, for Lily, for the life she wanted to build. The diner, once a cage, now felt like a battleground where she'd reclaimed her strength. She thought of her daughter, sleeping peacefully at her friend's house, unaware of the night's horrors. Nancy vowed to tell her the truth, not about the violence, but about the courage it took to keep going, to choose hope over fear. She'd paint again, she decided. She'd fill their small apartment with color, with life, with the dreams she'd buried for too long. As the first light of dawn crept through the diner's windows, Nancy stood, her apron still stained, her heart still bruised, but unbroken. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a survivor, a mother, a woman who'd faced the last straw and refused to let it define her. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the strength we all carry inside, please hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to Gentle Hearts. Your support means the world to us, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What moment in Nancy's story moved you the most? Let us know before you go.